10,000. That's not a projection, not a worst-case estimate. That's the live count of Zimbra Collaboration Suite servers sitting on the public internet right now, unpatched, actively being exploited through a cross-site scripting vulnerability that CISA has formally flagged as under active attack. If you run ZCS anywhere in your infrastructure, or if you inherited it from an acquisition, or if a client of yours runs it and you're responsible for their stack, stop what you're doing and treat this as an incident response situation, not a scheduled maintenance item. Let's talk about what's actually happening here, because the press coverage has been somewhat thin on operational detail and heavy on the word vulnerability, without explaining why this specific class of bug in this specific application is particularly nasty. The CVE in question is CVE 2023-37580. It's an XSS flaw in Zimbra Collaboration Suite, specifically in the Zimbra Classic Web Client. The CVSS score sits at 6.1, which is medium severity on paper, and that number is already causing people to underreact. Medium severity, they think. We'll get to it in the next patch cycle. That is the wrong call here, and the reason comes down to what Zimbra actually is and what an XSS exploit against it actually gets an attacker. Zimbra is an enterprise email and collaboration platform. It handles email, calendars, contacts, file sharing, and in many deployments it's integrated with LDAP directories and internal authentication systems. When you get XSS execution in a webmail client, you're not just defacing a web page. You're operating inside an authenticated browser session. You can steal session tokens. You can exfiltrate emails. You can pivot to anything the authenticated user has access to, which in an enterprise email context is frequently a significant amount of sensitive internal communication, credentials sent via email, password reset flows, and in misconfigured environments, access to internal tools that trust the email system for auth. The attack vector here is the URL parameter passed to the Zimbra web interface. The flaw allows an attacker to craft a malicious URL that, when clicked by an authenticated Zimbra user, executes arbitrary JavaScript in the context of that user's session. That means the attack requires user interaction. Someone has to click a link, which is why the CVSS score is medium rather than critical. But in practice, phishing a Zimbra user into clicking a link is not a high bar. Email is literally the delivery mechanism, and Zimbra is the email server. The attacker can send the malicious link through the same system they're trying to compromise. That's a tight little loop. CISA added this to its known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, which is not something they do speculatively. The KEV list requires evidence of active exploitation in the wild, not theoretical proof-of-concept code sitting in a researcher's GitHub repo. When something hits the KEV list, the question shifts from "could this be exploited?" to "how long has this been exploited and who got hit?" The answer to how long is uncomfortable. CVE 2023-37580 was disclosed in July 2023. Zimbra released a patch. Exploitation began almost immediately after disclosure, which is unfortunately the standard timeline now for anything touching webmail infrastructure. The gap between patch release and mass exploitation has collapsed to days or sometimes hours for vulnerabilities with clear attack paths. And yet, as of the reporting that triggered this story, Shodan and similar scanning tools were showing over 10,000 ZCS instances on the public internet still running vulnerable versions. That's not 10,000 small personal servers. Zimbra's customer base skews toward government agencies, financial institutions, healthcare organizations, and mid to large enterprises in markets where Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace are either too expensive, too geopolitically complicated, or both. Eastern European governments, African financial institutions, Southeast Asian enterprises, these are common Zimbra deployment contexts. High-value targets, in other words. Multiple threat actor groups have been observed exploiting this specific CVE. Unclear from the reporting exactly which groups are currently active in the latest wave, but previous Zimbra exploitation campaigns have been attributed to state-aligned actors, particularly groups with interests in government email systems. That context matters when you're thinking about blast radius. This isn't ransomware as a service operators casting a wide net for anyone who will pay. The targeting here has historically been deliberate, and the objectives have been intelligence collection, not financial extortion, which means if you're running Zimbra for a government contractor, a defense-adjacent organization, or anyone with regulatory data obligations, your incident response posture needs to account for the possibility that a breach may have happened quietly and left minimal obvious traces. Now, what do you actually do? The patch is straightforward. Zimbra released the fix in version 8.15 patch 41 and 9.0.0 patch 34. If you're running 10x, check the Zimbra security advisories directly because the patch numbering diverges. The fix sanitizes the vulnerable URL parameter. Applying it requires a service restart but no schema changes, no data migration, no multi-hour maintenance window. This is a patch you can push tonight. Before you patch, or simultaneously with patching, pull your Zimbra access logs and look for unusual URL patterns. Specifically, look for requests to the Zimbra web interface that contain script tags, JavaScript protocol handlers, or encoded versions of those strings in URL parameters. Attackers are not always subtle. If someone successfully exploited this against one of your users, you should see the malicious URL in your web server logs. What you won't necessarily see is what happened after. The JavaScript execution happens client-side. So the server-side logs show the delivery, but not the payload execution or the data exfiltration that followed. That means your log review needs to be paired with a look at user session activity. Look for sessions that accessed unusual volumes of email, that exported contacts or calendar data, or that made API calls inconsistent with normal user behavior. If you have a SIEM, write a detection rule for the CVE 2023-37580 URL pattern, and run it against historical logs going back to at least July 2023, which is when public exploitation began. One more operational note. Zimbra has a known pattern of slow patch adoption in its user base. Part of this is organizational. Many Zimbra deployments are in IT departments that are understaffed, running legacy infrastructure, and treating email as a utility that shouldn't require attention. Part of it is that Zimbra's patch delivery mechanism is less streamlined than a SaaS platform, so patching requires deliberate action rather than automatic updates. If you're in a consulting or MSP role and you have clients running Zimbra, this is the moment to push hard for either immediate patching or a serious conversation about migration timeline. The attack surface here is real, and the attackers are already working it. The broader signal in this story is one that keeps coming up with on-premises collaboration infrastructure. Email servers, calendaring systems, and anything that sits in the middle of organizational communication is a Tier 1 target. It has been for years. The shift to cloud-hosted email reduced this attack surface for organizations that made the move, but there's a long tail of on-premises deployments. Zimbra, Exchange, older Lotus Domino instances, various open-source alternatives that represent concentrated risk. Each one of those is a server that requires active patching, active monitoring, and active incident response capacity that many of the organizations running them simply don't have. 10,000 vulnerable servers in 2024 for CVE disclosed in 2023 is not a mystery. It's the predictable outcome of understaffed IT teams, deferred maintenance, and the incorrect assumption that medium-severity CVEs can wait for the next patch window. They can't when the vulnerability is in your email server, when exploitation is confirmed active, and when the threat actors interested in the target class are the kind who operate quietly and collect data rather than detonate ransomware. Patch to 8.15 patch 41 or 9.0.0 patch 34 or the equivalent 10x release. Pull logs back to July 2023. Look for anomalous session behavior. If you find indicators, treat it as a confirmed breach and start your IR process. That's the action item. Everything else in this story is context.